Today I'm going to be giving a quick overview of what we're going to be covering in American government. The first thing that I'm going to suggest is that you compile all of your notes into one place. So whether that be a notebook or you're typing it up, that you know where to go when you want to reference those notes when you're studying for an assessment, or you're preparing for a project, or you're preparing for a discussion that we're going to have after our lectures. So please make sure that you are writing answers to these questions down. You can always pause when you need to. I will build in time for that before we actually get to our discussion, but I may be calling on a few folks, so just be prepared. So some questions to ponder early on. What is government? What is the purpose of government? What role does the government play in our lives? Now, there are a lot of people who think that the government plays too large a role in our lives. Some that think it doesn't play quite enough, and some that think that it plays enough, but it isn't quite efficient. So I ask you, what role should it play? Please jot down some of your thoughts and be prepared to share. So what will we cover in American government? A lot of younger people want to get involved in the government or involved in influencing the government in some way, but don't quite know how. Often when you ask younger people, they say, oh yeah, well, we can vote. And there's far more that you can do than just vote. You could protest, and a lot of protesting has been happening over the summer for several reasons, and we'll be talking about that more in this semester. Some other ways that you can get involved, aside from voting and protesting, would just be being informed, making sure that you're looking at credible sources and your information is valid. And you just being informed and paying attention to what's going on from day to day means that you're going to have some impact and influence in others around you because you'll be talking about those things. You're going to be passionate about those things. Another thing that younger people tend to believe is that in elections, their vote doesn't matter. I understand that depending on the way the electoral college may work and what state an individual may live in, that may have some impact on who is more likely to become the individual that wins that presidential vote. However, when you go into the voting booth and you vote, you're not just voting for the presidency and that's it. There are far more candidates on those ballots that are at the local level, at the state level, and the national level. And your vote can have a major impact in that regard. So do keep that in mind. When someone says that to you, remind them that there are so many other things on that ballot that they could potentially vote for. All right, looking at the Constitution here, there's some major principles of American democracy that you should be familiar with, and many of you probably are already familiar with those principles. You had U.S. history last year. You learned about U.S. history in 8th grade. You had it in 5th grade. So, this has kind of been ingrained in you. But I'm curious, can you answer these following questions? Name one important idea found in the Declaration of Independence. What does the Constitution do? What is an amendment? Name one right or freedom from the First Amendment. What did the Declaration of Independence do? What exactly does freedom of religion mean? And so maybe you've learned these things, but you haven't quite learned how they might be applied or the different ways of thinking about them philosophically and ideologically. And so that's what we're going to hone in on in this class. All right, also looking at comparative governments as well. I included this because when we look around the world, most countries around the world claim to be democracies, even though we can see that they are in fact not. More than likely, they're closer to a dictatorship. But with that being said, countries do claim to be democracies because they run elections. And so the idea of a democracy, however, is that these free elections allow for the people to have a true, real say. Now, that real say isn't necessarily legitimate if, let's say, only one political party is allowed to run in that country, or there is there's a strong effort made by the administration already in place to prevent anyone else from coming into power. All right. Looking at the role of political parties, I think this is one of the most obvious things that we recognize here in the United States are these two major political parties, Republicans and Democrats. And many of you may think that you know exactly what these political parties stand for. But many of you may also just think that, depending on what your parents may be and what political party they identify with, that you identify as well. And you may not necessarily know all of the different issues that these political parties may have stances on. Also, if you're only paying attention to extreme media, you may believe that a political party stands for something ideologically or philosophically that it in fact does not when you're looking at the stances, when you're actually looking at the stances of that political party. So we're really going to be looking at the issues at hand and the kinds of policies that these political parties would be supporting. All right, looking at the Electoral College, it's very important to understand the Electoral College and the election process. And so, as you know, in 2016, and we also saw this happen in 2012, we have an Electoral College that decides the president, even though the popular vote does not necessarily jive with that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why that is and why it looks the way that it does. And of course, a lot of people have issue with that. But at the same time, we're going to look at why it would be very difficult to replace that kind of system and why that system, in large part, at least generally, has worked for so long. All right, looking at the branches of government, I think in the past, when you learned about history or you learned about government in, let's say, the 8th grade, you learned about it in a very surface level way. You didn't really understand the gameplay between these branches of government and the many different situations that can take course. You just learn about the separation of powers and the limitations of those powers, but you don't quite understand to what extent that might play out. But anyway, we're going to be covering that in a much more depth. Also, when we look at representatives, it is when we're looking at power play, obviously the makeup of the House of Representatives and the Senate is going to be very impactful when we're looking at that gameplay between those two houses and the president. And depending on what political parties they belong to or affiliate with, that can have a major influence in the kinds of policies that we see move forward. So in California, we do have 53 representatives. Add that to the 2 senators that we have, and we have 55 electoral votes in the Electoral College. All right, we're also going to be getting to the executive branch. And again, we see this being played out right now. We see very current, relevant things that are happening when we're looking at the power play between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Another thing that we're going to be doing here in American government is we're going to look at the extension of the executive. A lot of people think that the executive is just the president, maybe the vice president, maybe the cabinet members, but it is also these bureaucratic agencies that have been created under the executive branch and how they have so much power in being able to influence policy as well. So again, as I mentioned, the federal bureaucracy and the federal budget is a huge part of the executive that we're going to be looking at. And so we're just going to see how, obviously, when it comes to policy, how a budget can really influence the efficiency of those policies and how powerful and impactful those policies may be or have a chance to be. We're going to be getting into the judicial branch. This is probably the area that you're going to see more depth in than you have in any of your other classes. And so I'll just ask you, who are these justices? Can any of you name at least 3 of them? I mean, I would hope so, but can you name 3 of them? And you can go ahead and pause here if you need to look at the picture for longer. But I'll be asking this in our discussion. All right, so getting back to what is government? Government is the institution through which a society makes policies and enforces them. So when we look at government, we know that there has to be some level of order maintained, and typically that's through law. So policy is really a major focus that we're looking at in this class and is a major theme. I like to say that nothing matters unless it can impact or influence policy. The catch here is that everything can influence policy. So lots of different areas to look at when we're talking about policy, but some things would include taxation, national defense, education, healthcare. And so a lot of us tend to disagree on, let's say, where the priorities ought to lie and what should be emphasized and what should be considered most relevant or important, and what the government ought to be spending its money on or directing its funds to. In the United States, there are also multiple layers of government. Again, people tend to talk about government very generally, but there are specific levels of government that you want to be familiar with, and you want to know what each of those layers is responsible for. So if we're looking at the federal government, that handles national issues. When we look at the state government, it handles issues of concern for the state. Local government deals with county or city government, and that handles issues closest to the people. But keep in mind that these layers are not necessarily clean slates. They're not in charge of their own issues and policies. They often overlap and have to cooperate. So we'll talk about that as well. So looking into the purpose of government, some possibilities: it exists to defend the nation from outside threats and foreign enemies. Some people feel very strongly that way. Many people may believe that its priority lies in maintaining order and keeping peace at home. So domestic tranquility. Others believe that it should resolve conflicts or disagreements that develop between people and groups by passing and enforcing laws through its court decisions. So I would say that when we look at Supreme Court cases, that's truly what breathes life into the Constitution. So when we talk about the Constitution being a living, breathing document, it's this idea that, one, all Americans believe in the Constitution. There's no debate over whether it should exist as a document that runs this country. The disagreement is the interpretation of it. And we see that played out in the court itself. And even though the courts may make a decision, and that's the highest decision in the land and the highest law of the land, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's set in stone. Those decisions can be nullified in a number of ways. Amending the Constitution, a future Supreme Court case that can overturn a previous case. So that's what is meant by this document being a living, breathing document, is that it can be interpreted many different ways, and it can also change over time to change the decisions that overall influence the way that we live and influences the policies that we live by. All right. So for the purpose of government, some other possibilities: providing a stable, healthy economy by regulating business practices and monitoring the money supply. So the government actually has quite a bit of influence over the economy, maybe more than you know, and over the banks themselves. So we'll be talking about monetary policy quite a bit. They also provide public services to protect the public and advance a certain quality of life that benefits the people. So providing police protection, roads, education. And so this is really looking at standards of living, making sure that the services that are provided are allowing people to, live at the best standards possible, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they are, but this is kind of a goal. And so also protecting the rights of the people. And that's pretty straightforward, but we're definitely going to be exploring that a bit more. So how much is the government involved in your life? I'm going to be actually introducing this in the discussion, and we'll go ahead and have an assignment up in Google Classroom. So look for that, and you'll just be responding to how involved the government actually is, and if you can think of and discuss how the government's involved in your own life from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed. Okay, so look out for that. And that's the end of our lecture. I will see you in Microsoft Teams.